everybody can know to look up Irma. I want to make sure that you put, we don't forget to put in your website and your amazing, why would I mispronounce my name, show that is going to be in, for those of us in the Bay Area, twice in Richmond,
Yep.
California.
Gracias. Thank you so much for that plug. Well, Linda, you have a new book, and whenever I talk to authors, the first thing I like is to hear their voice. And so I have asked if you would read from the early parts of your book, the chapter called Palabras of Love.
Yes, that essay has been around the block so many times, so I would be happy to do that. All right. Palabras of Love. I remember hiding in my bedroom in Mar Vista, a suburb of Los Angeles, when I was a preteen and some Colombianas came to visit us, chatting in Spanish while I wanted to speak in English. One of these adult family friends came to my door and knocked softly. I know you don't like it when we come over, y está bien. I couldn't say anything to her, though the tears rolled down my cheeks. I stayed quiet until I heard her leave. I didn't know what I was feeling. On a personal level, the conflicts in the Latin American community from living in a country that demanded I choose English over Spanish. That meant rejecting the value of two languages and feeling uncomfortable no matter what choice I made. By then, I was unconsciously choosing to assimilate to whiteness, which meant rejecting the hugs, laughter, and Spanish in the living room. As predominantly Spanish-speaking immigrants, my parents were raising me and my two siblings to communicate and survive in a foreign land and a foreign language. But we never discussed the cost of doing so. While Espanol was my first language, it slowly disappeared from my tongue, although never from my ears, as my parents' close circle of friends remained immigrants.
Wow, that's so powerful. And that is such a common experience. One of the things that I observed when I moved to California is that there were many Latinos who didn't speak Spanish, which to me was very odd because I grew up in South Texas in a very Mexican American community where almost all of us spoke Spanish. It was unthinkable. And I made the observation that the more socioeconomically mobile people were, the likelier they were to have their kids suppress Spanish and promote English as if that were a way of being more acceptable. And so I think we've all paid a big price for that, and many of us have lost our language. But as related to your bringing up your children, you made a conscious choice that you wanted them to learn Spanish because you saw that the price of admission into Middle America, giving up the language, isn't really worth it. So say something about how you came to that choice that you wanted your kids to grow up bilingual.
Well, I think the main reason really is that as I got older, I slowly began to embrace Spanish again as a friend, a good friend. And I realized how valuable it was in terms of the work that I was doing, in terms of the relationships that I was having. So I had to come back to it. And that is what made me realize how valuable it was on so many levels. It's not, as you know, about just the language. It is about the cultural nuances. It's about the kind of the fun of being able to mix and match and find the word that is most meaningful to you, and not worrying so much about which language, but really thinking about how to communicate more effectively. And so since I had gone through that journey, and I wanted to, in some level, spare my children from several things. I wanted to spare them from the shame, right? Because even though my parents raised us in white suburbs, they expected us to speak Spanish perfectly. And so they didn't understand what they were doing. Like, they didn't get like the power of sending us out into white neighborhoods, and all our schools actually often had Latinx and other racial groups, but the language was 100% English. So they didn't understand it, and I understood it. So I wanted to bring that understanding to my children. So one of the things that was really important to me is, even though they consistently over the years of growing up told me not to speak Spanish and tried very hard not to speak Spanish themselves, other than, of course, they were in the dual language program, so they had to at school. I never shamed them or told them, don't you understand how important this is? Or, I never like gave them the long story of what the value that this would have for them. And I just trusted that they were wise enough in their own time to realize that. And they did eventually.
Definitely. Kids appreciate it when they're grown-ups, like, oh, thank God that I learned another language, that I had the opportunity. And it is so valuable. I've worked with many young people, especially young lawyers, law students, and they often ask me, what can I do to really stand out in the workplace? And I say, it's really helpful if you know a second language.
Yeah.
Now, not all of it, few of us really have had the opportunity to grow up in truly bilingual homes, but there are many people who have gone on and learned another language with quite a high degree of fluency. And I'm always impressed by that. And it's really helpful as a lawyer. I was so grateful that I spoke Spanish. I could speak directly to my Spanish speaking clients without an interpreter. And I found myself in court one time finding that the interpreter was misinterpreting. Not purposely, it was just a mistake, but I knew enough to be able to say that's not correct. When you don't know the language that's being spoken, you're at the complete mercy of other people.
You
So
really are. You really are. Yeah.
it is a great tool and a great skill to possess. And I'm so grateful that my parents raised us speaking Spanish. One of the things that I really love is all the subjects that you tackle that are hard to talk about.
Yeah.
Now, so many of our children, especially in the Bay Area, have mixed ethnic or racial ancestry. And you have a chapter in which one of your children tells you, what am I supposed to say when someone asks me, what am I?
Yeah.
So, how do we talk about who we are and who gets to claim that they're Latino, Latina, Latinx? Do you have to be 100%? Do you have to speak Spanish? Do you have to have cultural affiliation? All these questions come up in so many
Yeah.
contexts.
So many
So
contexts. Well, the first thing I would say is that, of course, as we know, race and ethnicity is our social constructs in many ways. They've been, the whole Latine, Latinx, Hispanic, that wasn't there, hundreds of years ago, right? There were indigenous people. There were people who lived in Africa. There were people who lived in Europe and Asia, right? And all the continents. And over the years, because of colonization, because of enslavement, because of the need for inexpensive or free, labor, people have come into what we now consider Latin America. And so there is very little understanding of the history and the understanding that in many ways, as I have said, I always say I'm a mixed race Latina because I want to acknowledge and embrace that there is no way that I don't have the colonizers. Gonzalez is the Spanish name, so that's where my colonizers came from, and that I also have African and indigenous descendants. I mean, people who came before me. And so if you look, I think it is so much, that's more to me about how you were raised and what you claim and culturally, right? I do think on many levels it is a certain amount of a choice point that people have in terms of that. Now, the problem is that because it's such a broad scope of a culture and race, I was just listening to a good friend who did this whole project about the Asian American community, and her whole point was, we are so big and so different and so diverse, and we are not given credit for that because it suits the dominant culture to keep things, to just give us these big names and these big titles, and that they don't understand, how that people get lost in terms of that. And so I would say that it's right, as they say, it's complicated. And on one level, I think that we have to go beyond what we are told is Hispanic, Latinx, Latine, right, by the dominant culture. And I think I don't think our community has ever really had these conversations in the way that they need to. I think that we tend to either get very much like, because we're always feeling the sense of scarcity. We're also always feeling the sense of competitiveness. Oh, we can't talk about these things among ourselves because it'll make us weaker, right? We have to have a united front. And then at the same time, we are using the same tools of the oppressor
Yeah.
to to create value within each of our culture. And every community experiences that.
Mm-hmm. The first time I saw someone describe herself as a white Latina, I was sort of taken aback. But the point that this young woman who was a graduate student was making is she owns the privilege that she has being light-skinned,
Yeah.
as compared to someone who is Afro-Latina and experiences racism because of skin color. And speaking of skin color and indigeneity, in one of your chapters, you tell the story. It starts out with your mother making a comment
Yeah.
about something hanging on your wall, indigenous women, and your mother says, "Que feas, why don't you take that off?" And you then go on to explain about, what is the concept of beauty and how just because we ourselves have experienced discrimination in one form or another, that does not inoculate us from passing it on and having bigotry and bias towards other people.
Yeah.
So the
Yes.
issue of colorism is alive and well, and it's something that we don't like to talk about. I actually have a scene in my play that's directly about colorism, even though my mother would deny that she preferred lighter skinned people. I would hear messages that it was better to have light skin.
100%. And as I think about, my mothering, and as I imagine you too, in terms of the legacy we have wanted to do differently, is to not pass that on to our children. And you remind me of another chapter where I talk about how my son, who is in relative terms, in the lighter skinned of both of my children, and but he is seen as being Latino in his elementary school because he's in the dual immersion program. And so he is called a wetback, which is something like, I was like, here we are in the Berkeley Hills of progressive people. And I mean, I remember just being like so stunned at that moment. And it just shows how group identity works, right? And that is something that could happen in this progressive community, means it's happening all over the place.
It is happening everywhere. And first and foremost, we do identify as being part of different groups, and it can change contextually. Like you may have an affinity for the people you went to college with, right?
Right.
Oh, I'm a graduate of XY University, and all of a sudden that's one identity. Then you may have another identity as a gay person or as a person from a certain socioeconomic class. So context has a lot to do with how we identify and what we do with our identity, good and bad, right? Well, tell us a little bit about how this book came to be.
You know, interestingly enough, it came to be because there is a platform called Raising Mothers that Teresa DeGroot, who wrote a lovely blurb for my book, started. And I don't know how I found it, but it is a platform that is focused on mothers who are women of color. And I pitched a series called Mothering as Legacy it was years ago. And I said, I want to just really think about what was I really trying to leave my children on a conscious level in terms of what I wanted to them to carry on with them after while I'm here, but even after I'm gone. And she loved the idea. And so I think I wrote maybe three of the
Hmm.
essays. and posted them there. But then it really got me thinking about this whole question. And so when something would show up or something would happen, it would spur me to think about how to write an essay about that particular thing. And I just have to say, as you say, it was hard because going through all these, if you're really present to the challenges of raising conscious children in a world that is so inequitable, it is very, very hard to try to figure out what to say, when to say it, how to manage it. As you said, all the multiple identities, they were parts of so many communities, as many of us are. And that idea that you and I have talked about, that, how do you say and embrace all those communities and say, yeah, I'm part of all of that and I'm my own mix. I'm going to take it all and I'm going to find a way to live the most authentic life I can. And it isn't, I mean, that's not something you and I have stopped doing. I know I still have those questions in my heart and in everyday life of, who am I going to spend time with, and what do I do with my money? And, there's just so many choices that we have every day and every moment, and about how we're going to frame ourselves. So the book just kept emerging as issues showed up. As I was raising my kids or reflecting on as I was raising them, I just began to do it. And then all of a sudden I thought, oh, you know what? This could be a book.
Yeah, I remember reading some of the essays in that zine or online magazine that you mentioned, and they were always very thought-provoking. So I found the book very thought-provoking. I bought 10 copies to give to friends. So everybody out there, it makes a great little gift. And as I say, you don't have to be a mother to appreciate it, because we all have had mothers and we all engage in mothering, even if we're not ourselves parents, because we look out for our friends' kids, our sobrinas, sobrinos. We mentor kids in school, especially those of us who are first gen college graduates. We always have, at least I know you do and I do, have this great sense of responsibility to use our social capital to help open doors for other people. And that's what parents do for their kids when they've had privilege. And we see
Right.
it as something that we do for our community, not just for our kids, but
That's right.
totally for our community. So there was a time when your daughter asked a question: if Black people and Latinos were to become slaves for some reason, what would I be? Would I be one?
And you sit there and you think, you know, we're raising our children in relatively privileged environments. And yet that, again, I just, in many ways, I think, oh, my kids had it better than I did, right? In many, many ways. And yet they had so many situations that were much worse than I ever had it. Like like I would never in a million years have wondered about that. I mean, and part of that is because there's the social consciousness. It's always that challenge. I know you're familiar with, where you want the kids to be kids. You want them to have that sense of joy and freedom, and not to be, laden with the difficulties that the adults have placed on them. And yet at the same time, they see and they listen, and I just still am amazed at, like, how that emerged for her. I couldn't even ask her. Like, I was so stunned. Like, I realized so many times in these situations, I was so, like, stunned that I couldn't even ask, like, well, how the heck did that come out of your mouth?
Yeah.
Right? Because of course, the thing about mothering and parenting and being connected to children is that anything, I mean, and I do think mothers do it, and we're socialized to do it. We take it to heart, right? We are always going, like, how did, like, what is it in the world that I have created for you that you would wonder about that? And two, like, how do I help you navigate such a heady, deep question for, I don't know, she was probably 8 or 9. I mean, it wasn't like she was that old, and that she already was so clear about the divisions in the world. She saw it, she believed it, she lived it, and that that she would, you know, try to understand who she is because her other mother is white, right? And that there was this social consciousness that she had in terms of understanding how divided the world is.
Mhm, mhm. So, Linda, recently you and I were having breakfast with another friend, and I was telling you about my new play, Class Migrant.
Yes,
And it's about socioeconomic mobility. And the title at that time was Class Migrant, ni de aquí ni de allá. And you said to me, tell me more about that. And I said, well, it's like we live in two worlds, a world of class and privilege and a world of people who have limited socioeconomic
yeah,
means. You know, a lot of people in my extended family. And then you asked something, and I said, well, I don't feel like I don't belong in this world or that world. I belong in both. And you said, well, why don't you say de aquí y de allá? So I called the theater and I said, change the title, change the title. And I said, it may not seem relevant to you, ni de aquí ni de allá, but remove the ni. It really means something different. And I was hearing a conversation yesterday in a webinar of women lawyers in which they were talking about this very issue, and that so many of us grew up feeling like that we shouldn't belong here and we
that's right.
shouldn't belong there. But now we feel, no, wait a minute.
Yeah,
I'm not imposter here or an imposter there. I am
right.
equally of both places.
Yes,
And
yes.
that is such a huge revelation.
It is, and it's so empowering. I mean, it just is it's such a freedom to embrace and to accept that there's no perfect anything. Like, right, that's about saying, well, ni de aquí ni de allá is saying I don't belong. And it's so interesting that they've changed all the languaging around all the diversity and equity work, and now the word belonging has become one of the big words, right? And all the now we got conferences on belonging. And at first I thought, oh, that sort of waters it down. But when I really thought about what is it that, the under, why would they use that? Why would that be so important to people? And I thought, no, because that is the crux of acceptance, is to feel like you belong.
Right.
Like I can go and I belong on the tennis courts, and I belong in the yoga mat, and I belong in the whitewater rafting, all the places that I go where I'm often one of the very few people of color, and Latinas for sure,
Yeah.
and to say, no, no, I belong. And so I really understood like the power behind that notion, and how it is such a the shift in mindset is so, it's really beautiful, right? It is about saying, how whoever I am, however I am, I belong, and
Hmm.
nobody can take that from me. Like, that's my agency, right? That's my right, right? It's my birthright, it's my legacy, and
Yeah.
it's what my family and my parents did for me. And again, that's really, really thinking about legacy in a much deeper, a much broader sense.
I really do like seeing this othering and belonging language because when you feel you belong, it's a wonderful thing, and we can belong in many different kinds of settings. And when we feel othered, it's very uncomfortable. And this is what we're seeing play out in real time with the Haitian community and these
Mm,
false rumors about we are othering these people so that we can keep the focus on they're not like
yeah,
us. They don't fit in. They don't belong. And as Latinos, we've seen this over and over and over. Native Americans, every ethnic group. I tell people, when the Irish first arrived, when the Italians first arrived, they were, if you read stuff from the 1800s, it is the same thing. They don't fit in, they don't look like us. And then eventually they became, quote, assimilated. We have a slightly different experience, partly because we've always had an ongoing group of people that comes and goes. We share a 3,000-mile border with the Spanish speaking world. So we don't have the cutoff of an ocean that was the experience of the immigrants that came in the 1800s, the early 1900s. And also, the entire Southwest was once part of the great Spanish speaking empire. True, the conquistadores came, but Spanish was here for hundreds of years before English arrived.
Yes, and before that, all the indigenous languages, and now
Yes, of course.
circling back to the chapter that you had me read from the beginning. One of the things that was really kind of was discouraging on some level to me was to realize that I'd given all this love to Spanish, right, embracing it, and then thinking, oh, it's just another colonized language.
Yes,
Like I have, like,
it
right,
is.
and then to go like I still have lost whatever the original languages of the indigenous people in Mexico and in Colombia spoke, right? Like
Yeah.
there are, so in many ways, I did still suffer this loss that
Yeah.
all of us did, because whatever it's like the Haitian speaking French, like whatever of that other languages is so often a European language, which was the language of the conquistadores. So part of me thinks it would be so, there's this whole other level to go to around, what was the actual original languages of
Of
our people.
our
Yeah,
ancestors, true. I don't know if you've had your
yeah,
DNA done, and I know it's not totally reliable because there aren't enough people who've yet. But anyway, I'm like 40% indigenous, and I wonder what those groups were, right? Am
yeah,
I Apache? Am I Comanche? My family roots are in South Texas and northern Mexico. There were all kinds of native
yeah.
peoples
So
who
many.
who came back and forth. I mean, there was no border,
Right,
right?
right,
For
right.
many, many millennia. But anyway, it's just such a wonderful read because it stopped me and made me think about all of these issues about who we are and what is it that we're seeking to do with our place in the world, to promote social justice, to empower people to speak up, to create equitable systems so that folks have a chance to succeed and to be their best selves. And so I highly recommend the book to anyone who is listening now or listens to it later. It's a quick read. You can carry it in your bolsa, in your purse, or your pocket. And there's just lots and lots of food for thought. Are there any things you'd like to share before we close? Because I'm aware that it's getting close to 4:30. We can still talk a few more
Tan
minutes, but
cumplida. You are just like on it. Well, actually, I'm curious for you, as if there was anything as you were reading it that you thought, like you may not have thought, oh yeah, that's something I really tried to do, right? Or that's, what you started thinking about in terms of your mothering as legacy, because I know that you were and are a mother who really thought a lot about what you were instilling in your son, and I'm just curious, from that perspective.
yeah, well, as the mother of a boy, and a woman who ran a women's rights organization,
Yeah,
I was always conscious of what do I want my son to know
mm,
about how you treat women, how you treat girls, what you say about them, what what actions do you take when you hear other kids say things that are,
yeah,
derogatory, and even as an adult, when that terrible case out of Stanford where the
yes,
swimmer raped the woman,
yes,
I said to my son, my son was already in his mid 20s. I said, your responsibility as a friend to a woman or a man is to make sure that something like this doesn't happen. You have a friend who's too drunk and out of his mind. It is your job to make sure he doesn't go do something
yeah,
that later is going to be a terrible consequence for
yeah,
himself and others involved. And always you look out for your women friends because you need to stand up. You have to be an ally. So I thought the chapter in which you talked about gender and raising, you have children, one is a boy and one is a girl, and no, they are not identical
yeah.
twins. Go figure.
Go figure. Yeah,
That you do see that there are differences in children. I happen to have many nieces. Tony was the first boy in that generation in my family. Otherwise, I had all sobrinitas. So I got to see the ways in which my nieces were different temperamentally. Some of it was, them. Others, it was just, that society from a very young age, people recognize. And I'll tell this story. When my son wanted his first flip phone, we went to the phone store and he wanted a hot pink Razor phone. And the guy who was selling the phone said, "That's a girl's phone."
Yep. There
And I
it
said, a
is.
phone doesn't have gender. A phone doesn't,
Yeah.
there's not a boy phone, a girl phone. I think it's just a color. If he wants a pink phone, that's what I'm going to buy him. So I buy him a pink phone, and he comes back from school the next day saying, the kids
Yeah.
made fun of me
Yeah,
saying
they
I
do.
have a girl phone.
Yeah, they
I
do.
don't want this phone anymore.
Yep.
So I said, okay, let's put duct tape over it.
But right, does that reminds me of the yeah, the stories I tell about my son and putting use and that that we can raise our children to be free in some ways, and yet they are in a world that will try to shackle them over and over and over again, and it's heartbreaking, right? Like it's as a parent to be like wanting people to not be worried about the color schemes and all the other things, and yet we they're they have to face that. That's the
Mhm.
world that they live in, and that when we all know that, right? When we have all crossed any line, that the
Yep.
status quo line, we will be try people will try to push us back into place. And so I think that part of it is, I think again, as we're raising our kids, and we're still raising them, as you well know, and being raised by them, they're still teaching us things, and we're still working to teach them things, is to just be there and to go, yeah, that's, you have to make choices all the time about how you are going to hold your truth
Yeah.
in
Yeah. Yeah.
a world that is constantly telling you what the truth is, and it is often not what you believe.
Yeah, and we talked earlier about color, race being a social construct. It is, but we also are tribal people, and we
Yeah,
tend to want to, often be with our own. And we're so lucky that we have very diverse groups of friends and community. But I know that when my son was dating someone and bringing a girl home, I would sometimes ask, well, what is she ethnically? And he would say, why does it matter? And I would say, it doesn't matter. I'm fine with whatever. I'm just curious. I don't know. I think her dad is Salvadorian and I think her mother's Russian. It's like, okay. I mean, the mixes of people are phenomenal. And that can happen in an area, in a big urban area where people have um, they're in
yeah,
community with people who are very different from them, and that's a wonderful thing to have the opportunity to know people from very different backgrounds.
yeah,
I When my son was in, maybe sixth grade, a classmate was going to come over and spend the afternoon and have dinner with us, and my son says, don't make anything with pork because Amr is a Muslim. And I thought, wow, he's already aware of that. I didn't know what a Muslim was till I was a grown up. I
right,
mean, fully grown
yeah,
because I didn't grow up in a community where there was anybody but Chicanos and white people.
right, yeah.
And
Right. Well, and that's part of your legacy, right? And that's what I mean about how that's the subtitle about raising and being raised. Because our children, and they still do, I certainly bet, I know mine do, so I'm sure yours does too. They still bring us things that we just had no idea about, or we've never would have been exposed to. And so
yep,
I think that's part of the legacy, right? It's not only of giving people a more diverse world than we might have been raised in. It's also about uh, listening to them and understanding that if we do that, then they're going to teach us things that we never got to choose because our worlds were more insular.
yeah, yeah. That's very beautiful. So, for all the things I've read about, the ways in which they're trying to push us back and deny us access to books and
Yeah.
whatnot, we aren't going back. Social change trumps all kinds of other things,
Yeah.
right? Once you've had an opportunity to see and experience being in a broader community, this thing about our food, right?
Yeah.
First we come and they hate us, but then they love our food.
I know. I
And
know, right?
we began to alter cultures. I remember a friend of mine, her daughter took a gap year, and she was in, I don't know, Thailand, and she called her mom and she said, "I'm so homesick. I really want a burrito." And she's Asian. And I'm thinking, okay,
Well, right,
this
because
is this,
we, the
this is
world,
comfort food.
we, in our heart of hearts, there are no borders. You know, in our heart of hearts, we love what we love and we love who we love, right? And so, I mean, that's real freedom to give space for that. And, you know, I think we have to give it to ourselves, and then that allows us to give it to our children, and to children in general. And I, you know, so the work of mothering is it is the work of being a full alive human being. And you know, I mean, there's no greater work to be done in the world.
Qué bonitas palabras. Well, that's wonderful. I'm so happy to have had a chance to talk with you.
Yeah.
And since you are my guru around this form of social media, and you said let's try and keep it
Yeah,
to 35 minutes, it's
we're there.
4:36.
Perfect. Well, mil gracias, como
Thanks to
siempre, comadre.
everyone who's
Yes,
watching. And I am going to plug my show, my one woman show. Why would I
please.
mispronounce my own name? Is playing in the Bay Area in Richmond, California, Saturday, September 28th at 7:30. And then the following weekend on Sunday at 2 p.m. That's October 6th. My only two performances in the Bay Area. I've been performing around the country at theaters and also colleges and universities. And check out my website. I've got a lot of little snippets of performances there as well. And irmaherrera.com.
All right. Well, look at, I did this little thing. You can press a button there that's got a smiley face, and then you
I
put
don't know how to do that.
it's at the
So
bottom of your face. But we will have more Instagram lessons to come. All
gracias,
right. Well,
Linda.
now con gusto, and thank you to everyone who was able to join us.
Yes, thank you so much, whether you watch now or
Yeah.
later. Adios.
Hasta luego.